You realise, of course, I'm going to have to go and see the Padre and do a bit of confession work there after that. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have his blessing. My mum and dad are watching in Gympie. They're Christian, so they'll be most pleased that God is on my side. Thank you very much, Chaplain. So Bernadette, as you know, when we met in Brisbane, I was most passionate about law and justice, and my professor, William McNeill, the great in the School of Law and Justice, is watching online, so I better do him justice. So I'll be serious today, and we'll have that fun conversation later. But the conversations that I draw today are actually not from the veteran community, they're from the defence community. And I don't stand here before you and say that I represent all of defence. I certainly do not. But I foremost love our ADF. I love the people that serve in our ADF. My husband among them, who served close to 43 years and is transitioning out of defence. So it's a little bit of a new space for us, this veteran space. And there are challenges with it, and there is that feeling of disconnect, of something that you've been attached to the umbilical to. I obviously haven't been a part of the defence as long as my husband, because that would have made him illegally taking, partnership with me. But I do conversations that are being had seriously in defence, serving members that do not have a voice because of their ongoing commitment in service, but are passionate nonetheless to have some of their issues raised here today. So I hope that this information will be well received. There are attached case studies that I will provide later, and that will also inform part of the evidence that I would present. So in evaluating interventions for suicide prevention, numerous studies have undertaken extensive review and comparative analysis to understand suicide risk and self-harm among veterans, to optimise the mental health and well-being of current ADF members and their families. Combat-related mental illness occupies much of the focus of contemporary narratives, as do risk factors specific to non-combat related conditions. But new conversations are now drawing from the connection between moral trauma and an increased risk of suicide and self-harm, where a person feels their deepest and most closely held moral beliefs and values are betrayed. This is increasingly being recognised as separate to post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety and depression. In particular, the research increasingly acknowledges that defence and veterans are particularly prone to experiencing potentially morally injurious events. Moreover, moral trauma is another important risk factor for ADF suicidality, and that's going to be discussed in depth by Nikki, soon to be Dr. Nikki. There is significant challenge interweaving a broad and complex discussion on moral trauma, as you will find out, and its impact in the ADF workforce into a single submission. So instead, this discussion focuses on two key areas of policy risk perspective: to examine the perceived inequities of already established dispute resolution policies that are to provide ADF members with access to a fair, just and inclusive workplace, and to explore the potential for exposure to suicide risk, self-harm and reputational peril for those seeking redress of grievance through their chain of command. And I'm wondering, where's the device to change the slide? I had some pictures here. Oh, forward. Sorry, just draw on some big heavy hitting guns here for a bit of support. Trust plays an essential role in the ADF service, and the research has found that perceptions of unit leaders as trustworthy and are able to be confided in reduces the risk of suicidal behaviours. Former General Peter Cosgrove once said that mateship can't exist without trust and reliability, and we evaluate mateship, but it must be built on the fundamental obligation felt by the individual to keep his or her word. Adhering to sound defence policy and lawful directives reassures ADF members access to procedurally fair decisions whenever disputes in the ADF workplace arise. Moreover, to reassure that complaints will be managed early and well. The current discussion on policy inequities maintains that the Defence Inquiry Regulations 2018 has the potential to expose ADF commanders to the risk of making procedurally unfair decisions, and I refer to the enclosures that are attached. That risk may cause irrevocable harm to ADF members, and an argument that may be well sustained by critical analysis of present case studies to this research. Moreover, putting ADF members at increased risk of harm and reputational peril. The former Chief of Defence Force General and now Governor General David Hurley said in his address that he wanted the ADF to set the benchmark for other employers, and if we are to achieve that aim, then we must explore the inequities of the Defence Inquiry Regulation policy. In doing so, carefully consider contemporary narratives that evolve organisational ethics and codes of conduct, reset the moral compass, to connect the ADF member to a more holistic and empathetic level of care within their workplace. That is, to honestly explore the impact of moral trauma originating from policy inequities and the potential this has in creating irrevocable harm to ADF members outside an operational environment. This discussion demands a fearless approach. ADF members repeatedly caution that submitting a complaint under the current dispute resolutions mechanism is to do so at considerable reputational peril, typically because the complaint is likely to be about someone within that member's direct chain of command. There is evidence that a growing number of complainants have faced some form of retribution, despite the protections and immunities afforded by the Defence Act. Repeatedly, ADF members have claimed to be subjected to administration processes that set the conditions to justify an unexpected or premature termination. For example, an impromptu psychological assessment that diminishes the credibility of their complaint and is seen as a way of justifying a medical or an involuntary discharge or a management-initiated early retirement notification. But whatever the process of separating the complainant from service, the associated trauma can be devastating too. The feeling of being betrayed by the system is repeated often in defence and veteran narratives. This can create a long-term negative consequence for both the ADF member and their family beyond service. This is especially true if the transition process has been initiated due to the non-compliance of defence policy or resulting from either a perceived or actual denial of procedural fairness. The overwhelming amounts of stress that this causes an ADF member and their family can exceed their ability to cope and lead to devastating consequences. ADF families can also be significantly impacted by decision-making within the ADF workplace. ADF workplace reforms that build a fair, just and inclusive workplace and reassure ADF members that they will not be subjected to some form of retribution for raising a complaint in the workplace requires everyone at every level to recognise that better work practices will greatly benefit everyone. In recognising that, there is also a need to understand the immense frustration that ADF members feel when seeking to redress a grievance. Even when or if they succeed, there is no reparation policy to undo the damage done to their professional reputation and mental health. Legal professionals who have assisted ADF members in formalising their complaints argue that it is how the complaints are investigated, managed, and concluded that is of deep concern. This is especially true for those fighting perceived injustices from within the workplace, alongside the perpetrator to whom their complaint relates. The defence inquiry process should not be part of the problem, it should be part of the solution. It should resolve issues, not create them, and unfortunately this is not always the case. It is commonly seen in practice that the ADF can and does utilise an abundance of human, legal and financial taxpayer resources to minimise liability to itself as an organisation. In contrast, an ADF member has far fewer resources, status and power to defend their complaint, even though it may be evidence-based and compelling. At least 40 inequities in the current Defence Inquiry Regulation policy exist, in my opinion. This establishes the contention for policy reforms to preclude implicit, turning a blind eye to, or conferring tacit approval for professional harm against ADF members. Moreover, those who fail to prevent reprisals against members pursuing their complaint before a defence inquiry, I believe, should be held personally liable for the personal injury their actions inevitably cause. This includes where they may have forfeited procedural fairness principles, denying ADF members not only the right to know of an allegation or access the evidence supporting an allegation, but even to the extent that investigations were carried out without the members' knowledge. It's incredible, but it happens. Sufficient evidence upholds that ADF members are rarely given full access to evidence that defence inquiry officers have relied upon in concluding their findings, and the list goes on. So the following recommendations are offered in good faith to plead policy reforms to ensure ADF members have realistic opportunities to resolve their complaint in the workplace, and in doing so protect their professional reputation and mental health. Workplace reforms require, skip forward, for rules of evidence to form the basis of all defence inquiries, providing a fair and transparent process to ensure complainants can assert their rights under equal opportunity law, and that hearing of the complaint adheres to principle of open justice and common law. Defence inquiry officers be trained investigators with a thorough understanding of applicable civil and military law. If this was the one thing that was adopted, it would make a huge impact. Did I say huge impact? Witnesses shall be required to give evidence under oath or affirmation, and inquiry officers prevented from relying on evidence that has not been cross-examined to ensure its authenticity. Those found to be acting negligibly, providing misleading or false information, should forfeit any right to protections otherwise afforded to them under legal privilege. And where any complaint is not resolved during service, there must be an independent appeal mechanism. to assess the fairness of the decision outside of the chain of command and entirely independent from defence influence, because, as we know, evidence upholds that the IGADF and Ombudsman invariably default to defence decisions respectfully. To put in place access to genuine mediation and early resolutions of complaints administratively by pursuing negotiated solutions for ADF members before a grievance is processed. And if necessary, establish funding to ensure ADF members have equal access to resources as required. Introduce a corrective action policy to ensure procedural fairness. And finally, a big one, implement a reparation policy. And this is so important, to acknowledge that the violations were committed against the ADF member, to repair the damage done by these violations, and to identify the root causes of the violations to prevent them from occurring again in the future. To conclude, pleading positive reform in the ADF workplace must be considered earnestly and in defence and veteran suicide prevention discussions, and it should not be construed as criticism. Instead, reforms should be viewed as opportunities to review a particular procedural policy that could benefit the ADF to improve best practice. There is wisdom in the ADF command. There is, as affirmed by the vision of former commanders espousing that the ADF be recognised as a fair, just and inclusive organisation. Suppose we are intent on achieving that aim. In that case, we must explore the inequities of the policies, failing to evolve with contemporary narratives of how everyone should think about their work and behaviour towards others. And supposing we do not consider the impact of these inequities and the impact that they have on the ADF members' professional reputations and mental health. In that case, ADF members will likely continue to carry unresolved grievances into life beyond service, assuming they do not suicide. Failing to act impacts efforts to realistically reduce legal redress claims, suicide risk and self-harm, currently plaguing the ADF community. It is therefore incumbent on all of us to embrace a new whole-of-life support system that focuses on minimising and preventing inequities that cause moral trauma in service. This includes addressing those policy inequities that encumber the administrative system from improving ADF best practice to advance towards a fairer, more just and mentally robust workplace. On behalf of all those serving members in the other ranks and in the hierarchy that have contacted me privately and confidentially, I thank you for your trust. I hope that I've been able to present your discussion and your conversation respectfully, and that Bernadette, you will consider. Thank you very much, everybody.